I am also of opinion that if negotiations had been open with England, the Emperor Napoleon would have relaxed in many of his views, especially with respect to Germany, but no one can tell to what fatality we are to ascribe the fact that whatever has been done and written in order to bring about a treaty has at all times borne a character of defiance or a tone of asperity, which instead of allaying misunderstandings and removing obstacles has constantly widened and increased them. Count Romanzov's mission being thus at an end, he took his departure for St. Petersburg. About the time of which I am speaking, the emperor opened the session of the legislative body, and in the speech which it is customary to deliver on that occasion, he made use of the following terms: "The Emperor of Russia, my illustrious ally, and I are united in peace and in war. I will now return to my army with perfect confidence. We stand in mutual need of each other, etc." Had there not been reciprocal engagements and secret understandings at Erfurt respecting future projects, he would not have spoken so openly to the nation. A fortnight after leaving the Emperor of Russia, he must therefore have relied upon the uninterrupted maintenance of the peace of Germany. Chapter 2. The emperor proceeded on the road to Spain with the whole of his army. He reached Bayonne and afterwards Vitoria with the rapidity of an arrow. He performed the latter journey on horseback in 2 days, reaching Tolosa on the first, and on the second Vitoria, where he rejoined King Joseph, who had retreated to this town with the remains of the first army that had entered Spain. He accelerated as much as possible the arrival of all the troops and commenced simultaneous operations upon Saint Endero and the provinces of Navarre and Aragon. Such was our superiority of force that our expeditions were nothing more than marches, except beyond Burgos, where we encountered some resistance, and at Tudela in Navarre, where Marshal Lannes had to fight a battle. Every other occurrence is undeserving of notice. The emperor repaired to Burgos, at which place he was overtaken by the troops. From thence he ordered the siege of Saragossa to be renewed, and his infantry to advance by the road of Aranda del Duero, whilst the cavalry proceeded along the plain by the road of Valladolid. He followed with the whole of his guard the road taken by the infantry and performed the journey on horseback. On the very day of his departure from Burgos, he reached Aranda, and on the next arrived at the opening of the gorge of Somosierra, a place called Buceguias, where he pitched his tent in the midst of his troops. He was overtaken at a very early hour the next morning by the corps of Marshal Victor, who was at first sent to support Marshal Lannes, but had been recalled previously to his leaving Aranda, news having just arrived there of Marshal Lannes' brilliant and successful engagement at Tudela. The emperor immediately ordered the corps of Marshal Victor to penetrate through the valley. We were now at the close of November 1808, and as the valley is lined with very high mountains, the summits of which are lost in the clouds, the Spaniards stationed there only discovered us when we were already close upon them. Otherwise, they might have done us very serious injury. At the puerto of the Somosierra, they had a battery of 15 pieces of cannon, which, had they discovered our troops from a distance, would have made us pay dearly for the desperate manner in which we attacked and carried them. The emperor himself was on the spot. He formed the Polish lancers into a column on the high road and made them ascend in this order at a slow pace until the battery began to fire, when, starting off at full gallop, they carried it ere it could fire a second time upon them. This daring attack was directed by General Montbrun and exclusively effected by the Polish cavalry, which, after forcing their way, continued on a gallop until they reached Buitrago, where the emperor came to sleep that very night. He advanced the next morning at St. Augustine, the second stage from Madrid, upon that road, and waited there for the rest of the army, which had been unable to keep up with him, and for King Joseph, his brother, who joined him on the 1st of December. The emperor expected that, as he was so near Madrid, the governing junta of that city would send to make proposals to him. It had not, however, been taken into account that we were arriving as quick as the news of our approach, and that this junta could not be so soon informed of the unfortunate state of affairs. It knew nothing of the Battle of Tudela and was still under an impression that the emperor was yet at a great distance when, early in the morning of the 2nd December, he caused Madrid to be invested and had his tent pitched within reach of the guns planted upon its ramparts. The general in command of the first troop, which approached the city, summoned it according to the usage of war to open its gates. A parley took place on the left, whilst the quarter of the bodyguards and one of the gates to the right of the city were already being attacked. The emperor's march had been so rapid that he had not allowed time for flight to any one of the grandees of the Spanish court, who, after taking the oath of fidelity to King Joseph, had abandoned him and followed the party of the insurgents. The majority of those who had returned from Bayonne were still in Madrid. They began to feel alarmed as they could discover no means of resistance within the city, and considered themselves as lost unless they could succeed in disarming the vengeance of an exasperated conqueror. They endeavored, therefore, to use their influence for the purpose of prevailing upon the authorities to throw open to him the gates of a capital, which could never have been occupied without great effusion of blood and without burying a great part of it in ruins. They succeeded in infusing a general spirit of moderation in dispelling all thoughts of a resistance wholly unavailing to the country's interests, and in suggesting proposals more in unison with the general welfare, a course which was rendered necessary by the extreme urgency of the case. Notwithstanding these endeavors, no terms had yet been listened to, and as often as we approached the rampart or gate, we were received with a volley of musketry. The emperor determined to force an entrance on 3 or 4 points of the rampart, where it was at a sufficient distance from the first houses to admit of troops being drawn up in the intervening space. He selected, amongst other points, the interior side of the garden of the Retiro, the embattled brick wall of which was beaten down by cannon shot to an extent of about 20 toises. The troops immediately entered through the opening in the most regular order, and by this movement the gate of Alcala was cleared, and the troops could take up their station undisturbed as far as the borders of the public walk on the Prado. The 3 main streets which run from the city to this walk were protected by entrenchments with a strong parapet behind them. At first, a sharp fire of musketry was kept up from the casements of the houses forming the entrance of these streets, and particularly from the hotel of Medina Celi, but it was soon silenced by the warm return made to it. And as the gate had been very imprudently left open, our soldiers forced an entrance, killed everyone they found in arms, and so completely plundered the hotel that it afforded a lesson to others not to incur the same danger. General Lavriere, who headed the 9th Regiment of Light Infantry, was killed by a musket shot fired from one of the windows of the hotel of Medina Celi, already mentioned. The position we had taken up served to open the eyes of the members of the junta, who were unwilling to expose Madrid to the dangers of a sack, which would have been unavoidable if once the troops forced their way into the houses. They therefore sent flags of truce in all haste to the emperor's camp with full powers to treat for the surrender of Madrid, which accordingly submitted to terms and acknowledged King Joseph. But as we had not been able to effect a complete investment of the city, owing to the great extent of ground which it covered, a considerable number of people left it during the following night. The population, as well as the Andalusian militiamen who composed the garrison, withdrew by the gate of Aranjuez and retreated in all directions towards Valencia, La Mancha, and Extremadura. No attempt was made to prevent them, and their return was left to the progress of time. French troops entered Madrid. The emperor, however, did not take up his residence in the city, but remained at Chamartin, a distance from it of about 2 leagues. King Joseph also abstained from entering his capital and stayed at the Prado, a palace of the Spanish monarchs, at a league from Madrid, and he there issued his orders and organized the new administration. The greater part of the Spanish grandees, who, after coming to Bayonne, acknowledging King Joseph and taking the oath of allegiance to that sovereign, had since betrayed him, had remained in Madrid and attempted again to make terms with the king. But he refused to receive them. They were all arrested as traitors and sent to France, where they were detained for a considerable time. One of them, the Duke of Saint Simon, was very near forfeiting his life because after placing himself in the same predicament with the rest, he had been taken in arms at the head of a troop of insurgents. He would infallibly have fallen a victim to the severity of the military laws had not the emperor been moved to grant his pardon to the tears and entreaties of his family. The leaders of the Spanish insurrection were dealt with nearly in the same manner as they had acted towards General Dupont, whom they plundered after capitulation had been allowed to him. All their property was seized. They were treated as men whose word was not to be depended upon, and no consideration was shown to them. It is of importance to relate in this place that an inspection of the Duke del Infantado's closet brought to light the correspondence of the Queen and Prince Royal of Naples with the Prince of Asturias, who, it was well known, had married a daughter of the Queen of Naples. The greater part of those letters were written at a time when the French were taking possession of the Kingdom of Naples and after the opening of its port to the Russian and British troops in 1805. The letters of the Prince of Asturias, to which the others were replies, divulged the impatient anxiety he expressed to his stepmother of ascending the throne for the purpose of aiding to avenge her. It is quite inconceivable that Monsieur del Infantado should not have taken more care to conceal letters of so much importance. They were found lying on a table in his closet, shut up in 2 old boxes, which had previously contained Havana cigars. The emperor remained at Chamartin until about the end of December, seeking in all directions for intelligence of the English army, which he had expected to come up with at Madrid, considering, as he did, that it was the main strength of the insurrection and that it must therefore have remained a short distance from the capital in order to foment that insurrection by every means in its power and retire upon Cadiz if it were compelled to make a retreat. So silent, however, were the Spaniards in their intercourse with us, so complete the indifference of the officers at the head of the cavalry, that whilst the emperor was sending horsemen from Burgos to Valladolid to collect news, the whole English army was upon the Douro and occupied Zamora and Toro, near the river, with its headquarters at Salamanca. The emperor was still at Chamartin in a state of the utmost impatience when the general in command of Valladolid sent him 3 Frenchmen who had been taken prisoners with the corps of General Dupont and were driven by distress to enlist in the free corps which England was raising. They had deserted upon learning the arrival of the French at Valladolid and brought the news that the whole English army was at Salamanca with its advance guard at Zamora. They had left the army there about the 10th or 11th of the present month, and it was not making any preparations to retreat, the transports not having yet arrived. These soldiers gave so clear an account of what they had seen that the emperor placed confidence in their report. He desired a reward to be given to them, but was much displeased at only obtaining these details through the zeal of 3 fugitives from English ranks, whilst he had upwards of 10 cavalry regiments in the neighborhood of Valladolid, who had not yet furnished him any intelligence. It is easy to imagine the extent of his disappointment at having come to Madrid, of which he could never have failed to obtain possession at a time when it was in his power to gain every possible advantage over the English army, whose presence constituted the whole strength of the Spanish insurrection. He immediately ordered the army to break up from its quarters the same day and cross the chain of mountains which divides the province of Madrid from that of Segovia by proceeding along the Guadarrama, that is to say, by the road from Madrid to the palace and convent of the Escurial. The emperor took his departure this next morning, which was Christmas Eve, in very fine weather, and with the sun to cheer us as far as the foot of the mountain, We found the road covered with a deep column of infantry, slowly ascending that mountain, which is sufficiently elevated for its summit to be covered with snow until the month of June. In advance of the infantry was a convoy of artillery coming back towards us, because the passage had been rendered dangerous by a storm of sleet and snow, accompanied with a violent hurricane. The sky was as dark as at the close of day, and the Spanish peasantry told us that we were in danger of being buried under the snow, an accident which had sometimes occurred. We never remembered so severe a cold in Poland, but the emperor was anxious that the defile should be passed for the sake of his army, which was augmenting in numbers at the foot of the mountains. Where no provisions could be found, he directed them to follow him and declare he would place himself at the head of the column. He accordingly passed with the regiment of chasseurs of his guard through the ranks of the infantry. He then made this regiment form into a close column, occupying the whole width of the road. He next ordered them to dismount, and having also left his horse, he placed himself behind the first platoon and directed them to march forward. The chasseurs advanced on foot in this manner, pell-mell with their horses, the dense body which they presented sheltering from the storm those who followed, and trampling the snow so effectually as to leave a free opening for the infantry. The platoon at the head of the column were the only troops that suffered much. The emperor was greatly exhausted by the march, but it was impossible to remain on horseback. As I was walking close by him, he availed himself of the assistance of my arm, and kept it till we had reached the foot of the mountains on the other side of the Guadarrama. He had intended to proceed that night as far as Villa Castel, but he found everyone so exhausted, and the cold so severe, that he stopped at the post house named Espinar, which is at the foot of the mountains. So great was the zeal displayed by every one in his service, that the mule which carried his baggage was brought to this wretched house, the only one found for supplying the wants of the immense crowd that had gathered round it. He was therefore provided with a good fire, a tolerable supper, and a bed. On those occasions the emperor was not selfish, a charge which it has been attempted to fasten upon him. He was quite unmindful of the next day's wants. When he alone was concerned, he shared his fire and supper with all who had been able to keep up with him, and even compelled those to eat whose reserve kept them back. We passed a wretched night in this post house at Espinar. Some soldiers actually died of cold. The emperor, however, by the example he had set to his troops, had made the whole army penetrate through a defile which for anyone else would have been the work of 2 days. He stopped one day at Villa Castel for the purpose of collecting the stragglers, and the army afterwards made a long march in order to reach the Douro, which they crossed at Tordesillas on the second day. The emperor himself proceeded at a rapid rate for the purpose of collecting any information that might be obtained. He ascertained at Tordesillas that the English army had left Salamanca and crossed the Douro at Zamora, taking the road of the kingdom of Leon. He was in the utmost impatience at the non-arrival of his infantry, and much displeased at not having been informed 8 days before of the English army being at Salamanca. Nevertheless, he still hoped to come up with its rear, or the stragglers. Marshal Ney's corps having been the first to arrive, he advanced in person at the head of it in most wretched weather, and penetrated over hedge and ditch as far as Valderas, where he learned the arrival at the town of Leon of a corps he had sent forward from Burgos. He stopped at Valderas in order to ascertain the progress of the troops in his rear and to send reconnoitering parties in all directions. It became perceptible that we were approaching the English army. The peasantry, when asked for any information respecting the British troops, replied that they passed by so many hours back and were following the road to Benevento. The emperor continued to hurry forward with the utmost speed, but the roads were almost impassable from the mud, and the artillery, being unable to follow the rest of the troops, were obliged to wait for its coming up. This was so much time gained by the retreating army. The emperor's impatience, however, was such that he sent forward the regiment of horse chasseurs of his guard in hopes of their coming up with the enemy. General Lefebvre de Nouet, who commanded it, being over eager to commence the engagement imprudently hurried forward, reached the borders of the Exla at the moment when the enemy had completed the destruction of the bridge by means of which the river is crossed on the road to Benevent. He saw the enemy's cavalry on the other bank and immediately formed the daring project of driving it back. He tried for a long time to discover a ford in the river, which had been greatly swollen by the late heavy rains. He found one at last, crossed the river with 4 squadrons of chasseurs of the guard, and proceeded at their head to attack the English cavalry on the other side. But he was soon overpowered by the numbers of the enemy, who drove him back, fighting his way to the ford, where our troops must have been all taken prisoners had it not been for the activity of the chasseurs, who quickly recrossed it. But General Lefebvre, determined, like a gallant fellow, to be the last to cross over, and he was taken prisoner together with 60 chasseurs of his regiment. This news was brought to the Emperor at Val d'Arras and gave him great pain, owing to the particular value he set upon the chasseurs of the guard. He did not, however, condemn the courageous determination of their colonel, though he regretted that he had not shown more self-command. He left Val d'Arras as soon as the cavalry arrived and proceeded with it towards Benevent, ordering the cavalry to follow. The river Exla had been so much increased by the rains that it was no longer possible to pass the ford at which the chasseurs had been able to cross. It became necessary to look out for another, which was only found at a late hour below the bridge. The whole of the cavalry passed over. The emperor followed, and we immediately marched to Benevent, which we left considerably behind us in the night, taking the road to Astorga. We found in the town of Benevent the requisite materials for repairing the bridge on the Exla, by means of which the infantry crossed it during the night. The emperor slept at Benevent and remained there the next day to bring up the army. The English were closely pursued, but they abandoned nothing in their retreat. We saw several dead horses of the English cavalry upon the road, and found they all had a hoof cut away. We afterwards learned that the English cavalryman who parted with his horse was obliged to bring the hoof to his captain as a proof that the animal was dead. Otherwise, he might be suspected of having sold it. We continued in close pursuit of the English. Our advance guard bivouacked every night in sight of their rear guard, but our column was extremely extended and had a difficulty in assuming a more compact form. This processional form of march we had of late adopted was owing to the storm we had encountered in crossing the Guadarrama, and to the mud and rains of Val d'Arras. The emperor's impatience was so great that he at last quitted Benevento to follow the army which was on the road to Corunna. I accompanied him, and we were riding at full gallop, when an officer coming from Benevent, which he had left a few moments after us, stated that he had just seen a courier from Paris, who was coming in all haste to overtake the emperor. On learning this information, the emperor stopped his horse, dismounted, ordered a fire of bivouac to be lighted on the road, and remained there until the courier's arrival, notwithstanding a severe fall of snow. The Prince of Neuchâtel was with him. He opened the courier's valise and handed to the emperor the letters which were addressed to him, although his countenance seldom altered. I fancied that he assumed a thoughtful air on reading the dispatches, and I was confirmed in this opinion by our remounting our horses and proceeding to Astorga at a moderate pace, without his uttering a single word. When arrived at Astorga, he no longer spoke of going on to Corunna, but waited for the whole army and reviewed the different corps in the order of their joining him. The English army had at last come to a determination. It was in full retreat and could not well stop at any other place in Corunna. The question was whether its transports would be found there in readiness to receive it, in which case there would be no possibility of obstructing the embarkation, or whether it would have to wait for the ships, a delay which our army might have turned to great advantage. The emperor gave the command of the army to Marshal Soult, and urged him to proceed by forced marches so as not to allow the English army any breathing time. He intimated to him that he would yet stop a day or two at Astorga, and a still longer time at Benevent, at both which places he would expect to receive news from him, which would either cause his return towards Corunna, if the English were compelled to maintain their ground in that province, or enable him to proceed to Valladolid if they should re-embark. Marshal Soult instantly marched forward and pressed the English rear guard so closely that his own advance guard was often engaged with it. General Auguste Colbert was killed in one of these encounters and was regretted by all his companions in arms. Intelligence was daily sent from the army to the emperor, which enabled him to ascertain their progress and the position of the English. He was still in Benevent when he learned the entrance of our troops into Lugo and was informed a few days afterwards of the arrival moving the English army. He now clearly saw that nothing could prevent the return of that army to England, and he prepared to leave Benevent forthwith. Chapter 3. The emperor had his relays so placed as to enable him to reach Valladolid in a day. He brought back all the horse and foot guards to that city, where he made some stay and sent forward Marshal Lannes to take the command of the siege of Saragossa. His attention was also engaged upon several other measures relating to the safety of the army and the promptness of its operations. He was waited upon in Valladolid by an officer from the court of Milan, who brought him news of the birth of a child to the Viceroy of Italy, but he showed some degree of ill humor when giving audience to one of his old staff officers, who had been made prisoner whilst fulfilling a mission confided to him at Corunna in the beginning of the insurrection. This officer had been kept a close prisoner on board ship during 5 or 6 months and had just recovered his liberty by the entrance of the French troops into Corunna. He came to inform us that the transports of the English army had not yet arrived on the day of the action which had taken place between Marshal Soult and the English army in front of Corunna, and in which General Moore, the commander-in-chief of that army, had been killed. The emperor could not repress a feeling of anger on this occasion. He again complained that no information had been given to him of the English being at Salamanca and Zamora. If he had been apprised of it, he would have marched forward to meet them previously to his advancing upon Madrid, and would have given them battle with an army 4 times their own numbers. He scolded everyone, but always with a certain degree of good humor, and was never so well disposed to grant a person a favor as after he had given them a severe lecture. He also learned at Valladolid from the Minister of War the arrival at Toulon of Generals Dupont and Marescot, the officers who had signed the capitulation of Baylen. This news had the effect of reviving his spleen, and he gave severe orders respecting them. General Legendre, who was chief of the staff of that division, had returned to France some time before and felt no apprehension of coming to join the emperor at Valladolid. The emperor refused to receive him except on a parade of the 17th Regiment of Infantry, which he was that day passing in review. There were 30 generals and upwards of 300 inferior officers present when the emperor ordered General Legendre to appear before him. He treated him with great severity and addressed, amongst others, the following observations to that officer. You are one of the colonels of the army for whom I entertain most regard, and yet you submitted to be one of the instruments of that disgraceful transaction at Baylen. Could this have been expected of you, an old soldier of the army of Italy? Did not your hand wither at signing such an infamous act? And yet, in order to crown the work, you became the organ of a fraudulent proceeding in order to deceive Vidal, your companion in arms, who had extricated himself from his difficulties, and to compel his taking part in a disgrace which formed upon his troops, without telling him the motive of your coming to him. General Legendre endeavored to excuse himself as well as he could. He declared he had not taken anything upon his own responsibility, but had merely obeyed the order of his commander-in-chief. The emperor pretended to credit the assertion, though he was not the dupe of it. He had been the more angry because a great number of officers of all ranks were listening to him, who might from one day to another find themselves in the same difficulty in which General Dupont and his troops had been involved. The emperor did not punish General Legendre. By doing so, he would have belied his character. When a man was known to him by many gallant deeds, an isolated fault did not ruin that man in his opinion, especially when he had in some measure acted under superior orders. Any other individual laying claim to as many courageous deeds as General Legendre, and who had been guilty of a like fault committed with premeditation and after mature reflection, would have been called to a severe account in proportion to the means which his judgment, experience, and position might have afforded him for avoiding it. So that under similar circumstances common to both individuals, the one would have been treated with indulgence and the other forever lost in his opinion, or, in other words, could never have expected any favor from him, though such officer would not have been deprived of the benefit of his previous services. The emperor received at Valladolid a numerous deputation from Madrid, which came to solicit his permission for King Joseph to enter their city, the sovereign having continued to reside at the Prado, because the emperor was anxious to see what turn the affairs of Spain might take before he would allow the king to make his entry to a capital which he might be under the necessity of abandoning a second time. I was present at the audience he gave the deputation. He had for his interpreter Monsieur de Edouville, the minister of France, at the court of the Prince Primate of Germany, whom he had ordered to headquarters in consequence of his fluency in speaking the Spanish language. He was much attached to Monsieur Edouville, whom he had known before the Revolution. The emperor desired the deputation to state whether this step was voluntary on their part and uninfluenced by any foreign suggestion, and added that if it did not proceed from their own spontaneous free will, it would be far from agreeable to him, and they were then at liberty to return. It was curious spectacle to see them at this moment bending their knees and swearing that they had come of their own accord, after having held a meeting at Madrid with the approbation of the king, who had authorized them to go and present to the emperor the expression of their spontaneous wishes. The emperor answered them in the following words: "If this is really the case, I am pleased at the course you have adopted, and shall now candidly speak my mind to you. If it be your wish to have the king in the midst of you, in order to assist him in enlightening your fellow countrymen and averting a civil war, to serve him as faithful Spaniards, and not to follow the example of those who, after taking the oath of allegiance to him at Bayonne, deserted their sovereign upon the slightest appearance of danger, I consent to his going to reside in your city. But in this case, gentlemen, take notice that you are personally responsible to me for his safety. If, on the contrary, you desire to have the king amongst you merely as a means of evading the burdens inseparable from the presence of so large an army, let me now undeceive you. I am the more distressed at your sufferings, as I was anxious to avert them by operating through your instrumentality the changes which I am compelled to effect by force of arms. The king's presence at Madrid will not in the least alter that position, unless you hasten to rally round his person all the enlightened characters which your country can boast of, who will have no sooner taken that course than a visible alteration will take place, and a calm be produced in the public mind, which is alone calculated to restore order in the different cities, now a prey to agitation and disturbance. Reflect well upon what I have said, and if you have not formed the firm determination of serving the king, do not expose yourselves to the unpleasant results that would attend an assurance to the contrary." They replied by renewing their protestations of fidelity, and were much astonished at the frankness of the emperor's address. They entreated him to rely upon the sincerity of their intention to serve the king, adding that they would never directly or indirectly take any part in the political agitations which were then convulsing the country, and they again urged him to allow the king to reside amongst them. The emperor told them in answer that he trusted to their word, that they were at liberty to return and have an audience of the king at the Prado. He would, on his part, write to him and let him know that he no longer had any objection to his making his entry into Madrid. It took place accordingly, and the Spanish administration prepared to commence its labors and cause its authority to be respected. Had it been possible to come up with the English army previously to this occurrence and compel it to fight a battle, which must have necessarily been fatal to it, the party of King Joseph would have considerably increased, but in the absence of that event, the Spaniards remained in an attitude of indifference. On the other hand, our troops were becoming so heavy a burden by their exactions and the vexatious conduct of several of their superior officers and even their generals that the inhabitants gave themselves up to despair. They at first exhibited the utmost sluggishness in complying with the requisitions made upon them. The difficulties of subsisting and of keeping up the communications instead of being removed were becoming greater every day. The stronger party enforced obedience in the tone of conquerors, and the Spaniards, whom it had been found impossible to persuade, would not submit to be enslaved. The excitement gradually grew worse, and both parties soon flew to arms. It is an undeniable fact that the misconduct of a great number of the officers who have held separate commands in Spain has contributed more to the general rising throughout the country than the want of success which attended some of our operations. The emperor waited at Valladolid for intelligence of the king's entry into Madrid. The information brought to him by several couriers from Paris created some bursts of ill humor. He one day sent for me to ask questions respecting matters with which he supposed that I was previously acquainted. It is proper to mention in this place that before quitting Paris, many motives arose for his urging the departure of the Grand Duke of Berg. I agree in opinion with those who suppose that he meditated the idea of succeeding to the emperor. He was weak enough in mind to give way to such an illusion, and some intriguing men in France would have desired nothing better than to see at the head of the government a man who would have constantly stood in need of them, and who might therefore have been turned to any account they thought proper. I do not believe the Grand Duke of Berg would have ever made himself the instrument of any attempt against the emperor's person, but as the contrivers of intrigues had laid it down as a principle that the emperor would infallibly perish in battle or by assassination, as often as he proceeded to join the army, some project was prepared which his safe return was as sure to disappoint. The case was still worse when he took his departure for Spain. Those intriguers asserted that he would be assassinated before he could have proceeded a distance of 10 leagues, and as they knew that the emperor was always on horseback and personally examined everything, they delighted in the anticipation of his coming to an untimely end. They accordingly set to work with redoubled ardor. In this manner was the emperor's service attended to by men whose duty it was to calm agitations and enlighten public opinions, instead of allowing it to take a wrong direction by setting the example of a wavering conduct which at last broke through all bounds. Each time the emperor returned to France, they found no other means of getting out of the difficulties in which they had involved themselves than by denouncing each other's misconduct. The emperor asked me if I was in the habit of receiving letters from Paris. I replied that I never received any except from my family, who never wrote on public affairs. In this conversation, he told me that he was not faithfully served, that he was under the necessity of having an eye to everything, and was so unfortunate as to meet with people who, instead of relieving him from the pressure of business, had contracted a habit of throwing difficulties in his way. To them is owing, he added, that the hopes of foreigners are still alive. They constantly prepare fresh embarrassments for me by allowing the latter to foresee the mere possibility of a disunion in France. But what can we do? We must only make use of those men as we find them. I told him all that occurred to me on this subject, my own opinion was in accordance with that of several faithful servants who were as anxious as I was for a continuation of his successes, and to whom I imparted the fears I entertained of the result of such intrigues. He said not a word of his near return to Paris, but stated to me his intention of sending a staff officer to St. Petersburg. I concluded, therefore, that his return to Paris had been resolved upon by his meditations on the journey from Benevent to Astorga, especially as the courier whose dispatches he had read on the high road had been sent by M. de Champigny. I learned from the Prince of Neuchâtel, who had received a letter from the King of Bavaria, that this sovereign had sent an intimation to the emperor that he should be on his guard against Austria, who was arming and getting all the resources of the monarchy in readiness. She had never on any other occasion raised a levy of the Landwehr. He had sent him a copy of the dispatch received from his own minister at the court of Vienna. The intelligence opened my eyes to what I had noticed for the last week, and I guess the cause of the mission of the staff officer to St. Petersburg. The emperor issued his instructions for the future progress of the military operations in Navarre, as well as in Aragon and in Catalonia. He organized the formation of a movable army, for which he left general directions and commanded his guard to proceed to Burgos, where it was to wait further orders. He did not bring it at once with him, because he had not yet determined upon the course he should pursue, his own plans being in a great measure dependent upon the movements of the enemy. He ordered his saddle horses to be placed in relays on the road from Valladolid to Burgos, with a picket of chasseurs at each relay, so as to leave a distance of only 3 or 4 leagues from one relay to another. The emperor often made these arrangements himself, and in the utmost secrecy. They can only be explained by stating that his saddle horses were divided into brigades of 9 horses each, 2 being for himself, and the other 7 for those of his suite who were constantly in attendance upon him. The draft horses were divided according to the number of relays, each consisting of 6 sets of horses. A picket was attached to each brigade and relay. Supposing, therefore, that the emperor had a distance of 20 leagues to perform on horseback, 6 brigades were generally placed along the road. The horses belonging to the grooms carried portmanteaus with complete changes of dress, and with portfolios containing paper, pens, inks, maps, and telescopes. If 20 leagues were to be performed in the calash or in a carriage, 6 relays of draft horses were stationed along the road. Instead of 6 brigades of saddle horses, both brigades were numbered, as well as the escorting pickets, and could be assembled in the night time without the smallest noise or confusion. The emperor's aides de camp were required in such cases to provide a horse for each brigade, but when the journey was performed in a carriage, they were allowed a seat in it. The emperor took his departure from Valladolid at an early hour in the morning in fine frosty weather, and arrived at Burgos at full gallop. He performed the distance in 5 or 6 hours. Never did any sovereign ride at such a rapid rate. He had also ordered relays of carriages, horses to be placed on the road from Burgos to Bayonne, only stopped the moment at Burgos and continued his journey to Bayonne without once getting out of his carriage. He remained but one morning at the latter place and immediately proceeded to Paris, traveling on at such a rapid rate that no one was able to keep up with him. He arrived alone in the capital towards the end of January and created an extraordinary sensation by his return, which was not expected that winter. The society of Paris, which rarely at any time turns its attention to public affairs, was engaged in the amusements peculiar to the season. The appearance of a new comedy is more spoken of in the capital than 10 battles won or lost. A foreigner learns in Paris whatever he desires to ascertain, but a Frenchman may reside in it in perfect ignorance of that which most interests him, without perceiving any void in his daily occupations. Count Metternich was at this period the Austrian ambassador in France, having been invested with that character about the year of 1806, and the interval between the peace which put an end to the campaign of 1805 and his arrival having been filled up by General Baron Vincent I have retained a perfect recollection of the time when he presented his credentials. He had been but a short time amongst us when he acquired a deep knowledge of all the intrigues which constantly abound in Paris. In vain was Monsieur Fouché's attention directed to the people who were on terms of intimacy with the ambassadors. He would not stir a step, and I have known certain representatives of foreign courts who kept up a regular system of espionage where politics, the government, public opinion, affairs of gallantry, and sure everything was attended to. These spies were generally employed to bring idle reports to the Minister of Police, who was often made the dupe of them. Monsieur de Metternich had extended the ramifications of his system so far that no man but the emperor was able to unravel it. He had succeeded in conveying every rumor he thought proper to the ears of the Minister of Police by means of a person over whom he exercised the most absolute sway, and whose services Monsieur Fouché could not dispense with. Prudence forbids me to reveal the name of that person, nor could there be any use in my doing so. The stories, therefore, which Monsieur Fouché came to relate to the emperor often proceeded from that personage. The minister imagined that he saw clearly through him, that the emperor had long ceased to place any reliance upon his reports. The spirit of acrimony soon began to manifest itself in our relations with Austria. During the month of February, to the best of my recollection, or at least towards the end of it, the power issued a kind of manifesto declaring that in order to declare its independence, it was about to adopt measures calculated to protect it against any possible act of aggression. This declaration made at a time of profound peace, when France had just withdrawn her armies from Germany, could not in any way rest upon reasonable motives of alarm. It rather appeared to be the signal of a new crusade under circumstances deemed by that power such as to afford her a prospect of recovering what she had lost in preceding wars. It was never viewed in any other light. Chapter 4. The Declaration of Austria had but recently made its appearance, when one of those days of etiquette came round in which it was the emperor's custom to receive the diplomatic body. The members who composed it were in the habit of forming a circle round the hall of the throne, where they took their places according to the date of their residence in Paris, an arrangement adopted by the representatives of the great powers, and the emperor made round of the circle, beginning on his right, and conversed in succession with each of their ambassadors, ministers, envoys, and others. On that particular day, when he came up to Monsieur de Metternich, he stopped short, and as some éclat was expected, owing to the knowledge which everyone had of the declaration of the Austrian government, a profound silence pervaded the hall as soon as the emperor was seen face to face with Monsieur de Metternich. After the customary compliments, "Well, then," he said, "something new going on at Vienna? What does all this mean? Are they suffering from the bite of a tarantula spider? Who is it that has threatened you? Against whom are your preparations directed? Is it again your wish to set the world on fire? How can it be that, when my army was in Germany, you did not consider your existence as threatened, and you do so now, when that army is in Spain? A strange kind of reasoning indeed. What must be the result of this? That I shall be compelled to arm in imitation of you. I should have to fear the consequences of neglecting this course, and it is my duty to be on my guard." Monsieur de Metternich protested that his court entertained no such project, that it merely took measures of precaution under circumstances which the situation of Europe appeared to call for, but that they concealed no ulterior views. To which the emperor replied, "But whence arises this uneasiness? If you, sir, have given cause for it by your communications to your court, why not tell me so? I am ready to afford you every explanation that will enable you to satisfy it. In suggesting to your court that she should add to her security, you have disturbed mine and that of many others besides. Monsieur de Metternich endeavored to defend himself and was anxious for the end of this conversation when the emperor said to him, "In all my dealings with your court, sir, I have always been the dupe. I must now speak plainly to you. There is too much noise for the continuation of peace, and too little for the breaking out of a war." He then passed on to another ambassador, and so concluded his audience, after which more than one courier was assuredly dispatched to foreign courts. The one from Monsieur de Metternich to his court was no doubt hurried off forthwith, for Austria was already assembling her armies, whilst the emperor had not yet at command the first elements of one. A conscription was immediately called out. The soldiers were equipped in all haste and sent off in carriages to their destination. The guard, which was still at Burgos in Spain, was ordered to repair to Germany. Never had the emperor been taken so much by surprise. This war completely astonished him. "There must," he said to us, "be some plans in preparation which I do not penetrate, for there is madness in declaring war against me. They fancy me dead. We shall soon see how matters will turn out this time. It will be laid to my charge that I cannot remain quiet, that I am ambitious, whilst their follies alone compel me to be so. It is impossible, however, that they could have dreamed of fighting against me single-handed. I expect a courier from Russia, if matters go on there, as I have reason to hope they do. I will give them work." The courier from Russia was not long in making his appearance. He brought a reply of the dispatches which had been placed in the care of the staff officers sent from Valladolid to the Russian capital. Alexander renewed the assurance of his friendly sentiments and informed the Emperor Napoleon of the details of what had passed between him and Austria respecting the projects of the latter power. Monsieur de Caulaincourt, our ambassador, wrote in still more positive language. He stated that Austria had dispatched Prince Schwarzenberg to St. Petersburg for the purpose of soliciting an alliance and of inducing Russia to enter into a new plan of war against France, but that the Emperor Alexander had rejected all those proposals and showed a firm determination to adhere to the sentiments he had manifested to the Emperor Napoleon. He went farther and declared that he could not view with indifference the aggression to which his ally might be exposed in consequence of the refusal he was giving to the Austrian ambassador's proposal. Mr. de Caulaincourt increased our confidence. What he saw and what was said to him were enough to lull him into complete security. We have learned, however, from Colonel Bouturlin at a later period how insincere were all of those professions. The Emperor Alexander, he tells us, was fully aware of the spirit and tendency of the clauses of the Treaty of Tilsit, but the unhappy circumstances in which Europe was placed at the period of his signing it had imposed upon him the necessity of averting the war upon any terms. Above all, it was an object of paramount importance to gain the requisite time for preparing to engage with adequate means in the struggle, which it was clear would be renewed at a future day. Such were Alexander's intentions in treating, such the good faith with which he had laid aside his arms. His conduct was not marked with greater frankness in the alliance than it had been in the negotiation, and if he did not immediately on quitting Erfurt violate the engagements he had entered into, if he did not make common cause with Austria, the motive is to be found in his inability to afford that power effectual support owing to the dispersion of his armies which were employed against Sweden and against Turkey. He had not yet laid aside, however, his affectation of enthusiasm. There was no exaggeration in what Bouturlin revealed to us of his consummate duplicity. True it is that every action is subject to a natural test, which is the touchstone by which false coin is detected. This test, which ought not to have escaped the penetration of our ambassador, was to be found in straightforward good sense. Scarcely 4 months had elapsed since the interview at Erfurt had taken place. The conferences were too fresh in the recollection of everyone to be so soon forgotten. What did we want for putting an end to our existing difficulties but the maintenance of peace in Germany? Who could effect this object? Was it the sovereign who had just removed his army from that country, or the one who possessed in it all the weight of his physical and moral power? Especially when that power had been found sufficient in 1805 to determine Austria to wage war, which she afterwards declared had unexpectedly come upon her. Was it unreasonable to suppose that that power, Russia, being united in intentions and in efforts with France, would prevent Austria from entering singly into the field when Austria herself had stood in need of being stimulated by Russia 4 years before, ere she would enter into the coalition against France? It would be an insult to common sense to attempt to persuade that Austria would have ventured to commence the war had the Russians positively declared to her that they would take the field with us, or had they even made a semblance of doing so. If, therefore, the Austrians were the first to throw down the gauntlet, it is because they had at least the assurance of an armed neutrality, such as they themselves had maintained after the Battle of Eylau. These are the particulars which it was important for the emperor to be possessed of, but which the course of events brought too late to his knowledge. A feeling of uneasiness began to prevail when the news was brought that in the council had, on the return of Prince Schwarzenberg from St. Petersburg, war had been determined upon, notwithstanding the objections of General Meyer, a member of that council, who declared in plain terms that to make war against France without the concurrence of Russia was an act of pure folly. The opinion of General Meyer was of some weight at that time, and its not having been assented to clearly proves that certain expectations were entertained which had not been communicated to the council. The emperor, still relying upon what Monsieur de Caulaincourt had communicated to him, trusted that Russia would not limit herself to a mere neutrality, and that her threats would be followed up by measures calculated to keep Austria within bounds. He was undeceived, however, when he learned through his ambassador at Vienna what had taken place on Prince Schwarzenberg's return. He soon decided upon the course he had to pursue. In other words, he formed the resolution of depending solely upon himself, since all the promises made at Tilsit and at Erfurt were reduced on the part of Russia to her managing her affairs quietly with her own enemies, and leaving us to settle with ours, presuming, no doubt, that we were much beholden to her for not joining them against us. I never saw the emperor so calm at any time as when he received this information. We shall now see, he said, whether Russia deserves the name of a great power, and whether she will march to assist me, as she did to assist Austria in 1805. France, her ally, is attacked. I claim her assistance. Let us see in what manner she will come forward. He complained of the inefficient manner in which he was served, nor was it altogether without just grounds that he did so, but no time was to be lost to avert the meditated attack. He forthwith demanded of the sovereigns and confederated princes their respective contingents, which troops were necessarily to form the principal part of his army. He sent his orders to Italy and attended in France to all the measures that were to precede his departure and be carried into effect during his absence. The unexpected news of the Austrian preparations for war created the deepest sensation upon the public mind. The nation found itself again involved in interminable wars. And as the legislative body had closed its sittings, there was no possibility of resorting to that channel for entering into explanations concerning this event and calming the uneasiness created by so unexpected an occurrence. In France, when public opinion does not receive a proper direction, it invariably becomes the sport of intriguers who make it subservient to sinister purposes. This was the case on the present occasion. The omission to lay open to the public the conduct of Austria afforded to evil-minded people an opportunity of assigning to her all the honors of this new war, the cause of which was designedly ascribed to the attempt upon Spain. The ambassador of Austria, who still remained in Paris, where he essentially promoted the views of his court, was not slow in taking advantage of a bias in the public opinion which was so favorable to his views, and he availed himself of the means above adverted to for the purpose of conveying the belief that Austria was devoting herself for the Spanish cause, which was espoused by all the powers of Europe. He had so often made the assertion that it was taken up and repeated by the very minister of police who had become his dupe. I heard some extraordinary reports on this occasion in the police department itself. These and many others were quite enough to satisfy me that Monsieur Fouché had never possessed any influence over the minds of any but notoriously credulous people, and that he was always the dupe of every clear-sighted man whom he fancied he had been imposing upon. He did the emperor serious injury this year by suffering the opinion respecting Spain to gain ground, which was only spread with the view of depriving him of the popularity he had acquired when he should either have opposed that opinion, explained it away, or at least resisted its effects.